Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Silk. I'm an Associate Director in the Capital Markets Practice at Instinctif Partners. And thank you all for coming and welcome. Particular thanks to Roy for agreeing to share some insights with us, as well as Leila, fresh from her trip to Davos. And we're looking forward to hearing one or two interesting insights there too. And to everyone else, and to Deanne Chatterton, our CEO, thank you for giving us the platform to host this event. I'm indebted. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in an age fraught with corporate scandal. Listed businesses are under greater pressure than ever before to be transparent and to ensure that their disclosures are in line with global best practice. Matters around governance and other ESG considerations have rightfully found their way to the board table, and for this reason, issuers such as the JSE must be commended. What I find remarkable about Roy's professional career is not the breadth of sector expertise or even the scale of the various leadership positions that he's held, but rather the circumstances, several of which were era-defining, in which he undertook these roles. In an executive capacity, as the partner responsible for managing the South African merger between global assurance firms Ernst & Winnie and Arthur Young, Roy cut his teeth in the art of stakeholder management, and today EY is recognized as arguably the cleanest and most respected of the Big Four audit firms. Reputation is everything. He was invited to lead the JSE in the capacity of executive president during South Africa's transition to democracy, negotiating the interests of various established and emerging groups during this tumultuous and uniquely transformative period. That cannot have been an easy task. And then he was headhunted to directly succeed Sir Donald Gordon of blessed memory, the founder of the iconic Liberty Group, which at the time was a mega cap with sprawling diverse interests across multiple geographies. His tenure there was considered by commentators to be a highly successful one in an industry that was rapidly evolving and characterized by many legislative changes. As mentioned, the scale of the highly charged circumstances surrounding each of these roles is what I find most interesting. In a non-executive capacity, Roy chaired several blue chips, including Sanlam and Murray & Roberts. I personally got to know Roy during his tenure as chair of Sasfin Bank, where he presided over milestones including the group's landmark BE transaction with Wiphold, the establishment of its transactional banking business unit, managing a smooth CEO transition, as well as the group's bold decision to fire KPMG. Hope no one from KPMG is here, to fire KPMG as its auditor in the initial wake of the state capture scandal. There are few people in South Africa as qualified to discuss issues around governance as Roy. As a founding member of the King Committee in 2021, at the behest of the then Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, Roy was parachuted in to restore governance and parity at the Independent Regulatory Board for Auditors, together with Nonkululeko Kobodo. Their caretaker tenure was successfully concluded with the appointment of a new board in June of the same year. Finally, I've learned many valuable lessons from Roy over the years, but one short idea that I'd like to share is centered on governance itself. I sat in several board and board subcommittee meetings in which Roy was either the chair or a committee member, and occasionally I came across a director that was inadequately prepared, who hadn't sufficiently reviewed the pack, and identified questions to ask of management, not Roy. Apart from a always polite and courteous demeanor, Roy took his job and life seriously. He had always rigorously interrogated the pre-reading and always came to meetings thoroughly prepared, no matter how seemingly insignificant the meeting was in the broader picture. This is Roy. Life is serious, work is serious, and this is a small lesson that I've tried to inculcate in my daily professional habits. Roy does have a relaxed side too, a social side. And again, I just want to say thank you all for attending. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Leila Fourie, who will share some insights and formally introduce the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's absolutely lovely to be here on this very fresh autumn morning. I see many familiar faces, and it's an absolute pleasure to speak a little bit about leadership before we hear from renowned business leader and former president of the JSE, Roy Andersen. I'm just looking for Jeff. I saw him in the crowd earlier. There he is. Jeff Rothschild is also in the audience, and he was one of our chairmen, our prior chairman at the JSE. So we're certainly surrounded by JSE leaders, past and present. We have never needed effective leadership as we do now. The world faces multiple points of inflection. We're facing into geopolitical tensions, a war, inequality, food insecurity, and the demand on all of us, particularly on leaders, are very intense. And so the question is really, how do we lead? How do we inspire others? And these are questions that trouble all of us, but perhaps the best preparation is the pandemic itself. I personally don't like to trade in superlatives, but this really was the greatest public health crisis in living history, and particularly since its predecessor, the Spanish flu, which was just over 100 years ago. When COVID-19 hit, we had no playbooks, and ironically, the only people who had ever thought seriously about a pandemic were the directors of Hollywood. Business schools and think tanks and business leaders certainly had never imagined the extent of the disruption and the amount of trauma that people would be going through, particularly in the first year of the pandemic. And so I look backwards to look forward, and I learned a lot from Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who in 1965 AD dealt with the Antonine Plague. He was the Roman Empire, and the basis of his behavior formed the basis of Stoicism, which is a very popularized and rising philosophy. What he did in the beginning was to remain calm. He reminded everybody that this has happened before and it will happen again. He embraced Stoicism, which is that we have all been at the mercy of events that are completely outside of our control. During the entire period, Marcus stayed in Rome, where everybody else fled. He attended funerals, and he went to visit families of the deceased and showed empathy. He had a shrewd eye for talent, and he surrounded himself with competent people. He was generous. He gave his wife's jewelry to fund health research. And unfortunately, he eventually succumbed to the plague. Even on his deathbed, he had prepared for succession. And so I suppose that was quite an ancient history example. Slightly more, but still older example is some of you may know that I climb mountains as a hobby. And perhaps it was natural that during the crisis, I'd look through the memoirs and reread Shackleton's book. It was a great resource to me. And he was back in the news earlier this year when his ship Endurance was found. It was discovered under sea 111 years after it was crushed by ice, and it sank just off the coast of Antarctica. Shackleton's leadership became the stuff of legend. He failed in his quest to become the first person to traverse the Antarctica, but he made his name by saving his entire crew from what was almost certain death. He kept them on ice floes for months as he embarked on an incredibly courageous and at times seemingly impossible 1,200-kilometer trip in an open dinghy in open seas to get to the South Georgia island. Shackleton constantly reinvented his playbook. He got his team to buy in, and he believed in him, and they believed in him. He believed in them, and they believed in him. It really needs the strength of character in times of crisis and leadership times. And it involves, when you're dealing through a crisis, a counterintuitive blend of trust in yourself and also the courage to accept that you might be wrong. So in many instances during the crisis, I had to accept that I perhaps wasn't the cleverest person in the room at that point in time. And we need to accept and start to crowd in professional and insightful voices on specialist topics. So it's a mix of courage, vulnerability, honesty, and authenticity, which is overlaid with the agility to change course if you realize that a plan isn't working. There might not be any playbook for the health crisis, but wars have left more than enough lessons for us to learn from. At the end of the Cold War, which loomed in 1987, the US War College devised a course under the acronym VUCA, which was to prepare its leaders and prepare its future leaders particularly for the post-Cold War world. VUCA, which sounds like the isiZulu word vuka, means to waken, and it's an acronym that best describes this current world. The acronym is one of volatility, uncertainty, underpinned by complexity and ambiguity. It was such a successful concept that a matrix to cope with the potential Third World War was quickly reverse engineered from a sword to a plowshare and taught us the next generation of business leaders. It makes sense because, like the flapping of the butterfly's wings, everything is connected. We saw how a health pandemic led to economic contagion, and so too the consequences of the war in Ukraine stretch far beyond the building on the other side of the world, which is struck by an invisible missile. Which brings us to our keynote speaker. Roy Andersen has had a stellar career as a business leader during some of the most tumultuous times, including being president of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange between 1992 and 1997. But he also has a unique distinction of having been this country's most senior defense reserve officer, including being on the battlefield himself 45 years ago in southern Angola and commanding the artillery regiment. I can't think of anyone as diverse, with as diverse a set of skills and scope of experience who is adept to speak on leadership in a time of war and disruption as someone like Major General Roy Andersen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Leila. As you were talking, I was looking at the slide and I couldn't help but conclude that things have improved at the JSE over the years. But thank you very much for that very gracious introduction. Good morning, everybody. Let me say it really is a pleasure to address you today because, first of all, I consider it an honor to be asked. But second of all, I welcome the opportunity of communicating with you about leadership. I'm a little bit nervous, I'll tell you why. From this point of view, when I published my book, which compared business and military leadership, there was a lady who reviewed it in the Saturday Star, and she was fairly gracious. She never interviewed me, she just read the book. And her final line, however, was, however, Winston Churchill's position in literature is not under threat. So that put my book into some sort of perspective. But I guess I should be pleased to be mentioned in the same breath. I just want to pick up on something you said, Brian. Firing KPMG as our auditors was not a pleasurable step. And I quickly want to say that our audit partners were superb, honest, upright, excellent auditors. They just got let down by a few people. So I would hate the whole firm to be branded. And I'm so delighted to see my former competitor coming back now. It is a great firm and always will be. There's a leadership vacuum in South Africa at the moment. There's a vacuum of honest, ethical, and brave leaders in this country. There is no doubt. I want to start off by telling you a story, and Jeff, forgive me, you were there on the occasion. There are witnesses. I said, ladies and gentlemen, if we tell this story in 20 to 25 years' time, and people still know what a hobo is, and people still know what unemployment is, this country will be in big trouble. I said that 25 years ago. Well, sadly, there are more hobos and there are more unemployed. And we saw the consequences last July, especially down in KZN. I'm not here to depress you, but Leila referred to the challenges we face. I think South Africa faces the greatest challenge it's ever faced. I'm sure people who were around during the Anglo-Boer War, First World War, Smuts' era, and even the transition to our democracy might disagree. But let me just go through a quick list, and then I'll turn positive. So where are we now? Ongoing corruption, lawlessness, a lack of accountability, collapsing infrastructure, municipalities and civil service, power and water outages, natural disasters such as COVID and the floods, an unsettled land issue, a flight of skills from the country, fallout from the war in Ukraine, weakened security forces, and a threat that is looming from northern Mozambique. I didn't go through that list to depress you. I went through that list to reinforce my point that South Africa needs strong ethical leadership now. So let's talk about leadership. That's what I'm going to talk about. What is leadership? What are the attributes of a good leader? And then how do you implement your plan? So I'm going to talk about leadership in general, but I'll try and then focus on special requirements during this time. I'm mindful of the fact that, as Leila indicated, many of the leaders in this room were not leading in the late 80s, which was traumatic. To be a leader of business in the 1980s was traumatic. But the leaders of today, and I'm full of admiration, particularly how they're dealing with the new world of working from home, etc., but they weren't there then. And I think the challenges might be greater. So, let me go back. What is leadership? This is a cynical view from General Eisenhower. He said, leadership is the art of getting someone else to do something you want done because he wants to do it. Sounds cynical, but there's actually some underlying truth in it. That's all about leading people, motivating people. But then the next question I ask myself is, why are some companies in the same industry more successful than others? Why? Or one could also say, why are some countries with the same inherent resources more successful than others? I think the answer lies in the following points. First of all, and let's talk about companies, a lot of it has to do with the vision. What is the vision of this company? Now, the vision could be small, like killing the crocodiles, getting rid of the inefficiencies. Or it could be big and hairy. Start a Discovery Life. Start Uber. Start Airbnb. But every entity needs a clear vision. Second one is planning. Third one is execution. How many of you have been to a bad Bosparade? Very few. You go on a Bosparade, CEO stands up, motivates everybody. Sometimes there's a facilitator. Starts off great. It takes a dip. And if the leadership is good, you leave on a rah-rah, and we've now got a clear plan for the future. We've all been on those. The question is, how many of those plans have you seen actually implemented? We're great talkers. We're not necessarily great doers. The second last bullet is probably the most important one. It's all about leadership. And then, of course, luck does play a part, but luck of the Gary Player type. Now, how do you get buy-in for your plan? I'm preaching to people who implemented many plans, so I'm perhaps being a bit ambitious. But to get your plan implemented, you need to communicate. Communicate. But as Leila indicated with her example, you've got to inspire the people around you. You've also got to simplify. When you stand as CEO and you stand before your management team, as we all do, what are they saying to themselves? their question to themselves is, what's in it for me? I can see what's in it for the company. I can see what's in it for the shareholders. But what's in it for me? And therefore, you have to link it to some form of reward. And Leila, you've probably heard these stories, and Jeff and I can talk about it later as well. When we restructured the JSE, when we deregulated the JSE, we changed every single thing. Closed the trading floor down. Changed the listings requirements, mainly bringing in the British one. Changing the capital requirements. Allowing the banks become members of the JSE. Allowing foreign stockbrokers to become members. There wasn't a single thing in that JSE that wasn't re-engineered. Every single thing. So how did we do it? First of all, it took 3 years to do the research. Michael Katz chaired a committee that went through the analysis, and it took 3 years of detailed analysis. As an aside, a person who needs a lot of credit is Jill Marcus. She was chairing the parliamentary committee. So picture the scene. We've been trading a certain way for 100 years. The government changes, and we go and see them in Cape Town and say, it's been working this way for 100 years, but we want to change everything. And the government's just changed. Now you can imagine automatic suspicion, concern. Are they trying to pull a fast one? Jill got on an aeroplane, she flew to London, she spent a week at the London Stock Exchange, and she came back and she said, done, I support you, you're doing the right thing. But history books don't necessarily record the role of Jill Marcus. The way we actually implemented, with a great deal of support from the committee were really involved. It was like non-executive directors getting their fingers into the pies, because they were the stockbrokers, they had the expertise. We knew what we wanted to do. We had a roadmap, we had a detailed plan. And I always said to the staff, right, I want you to volunteer. This was to the management. You volunteer for a segment. It doesn't necessarily even have to be your own discipline, but you take ownership of that. Go away. They came back a week later with their budgets and their plans, which obviously I had to sell to the board afterwards. And I said to them, here's the deal. If you meet your target, a major bonus, serious bonus. If you miss by 1 minute, no bonus. Guess what? Everybody collected their bonus. And from start to finish, the research phase, 3 years, implementation, 2 years. So what did we do? We made it relevant and we rewarded them. So the question is, let me go back. There we go. Are leaders born or are they made? The answer is both. Leadership can be taught. When I was a young officer in the Defence Force, you could say a lot about the old SADF. You can. And let's not talk about the cause that was being fought for. That's very debatable. But what they did do, they took 17-year-olds out of matric, and within 6 to 9 months we were fighting in Angola. Now look how the Russians are battling using conscripts. We were conscripts. What was the difference? Leadership. And I was an officer when I was still 17. So I had 150 men under my command, but they wouldn't give me a driver's license because I wasn't 18. But they taught us how to lead. And often a lot of that teaching was by example. So let's have a look at the attributes. What are the attributes of a good leader? And I'm going to look specifically in South Africa at the moment. But I ask you as I talk, measure your boss against these attributes. Measure your politician, but most important, measure yourself. So what do the leaders do? And it's a long list. Let me go back. You set the ethical tone. There is no doubt that the ethical tone in the organization is set by the leader. Boris Johnson's cocktail party issue, it's not just about having a few glasses of wine. It raises a whole ethical tone issue, doesn't it? What is the tone in government in the UK? And I really feel for leaders of today. With people working from home, how do you do that? There's no water cooler talk. Now, we learnt our ethics from our leaders. They showed us this is the way this company does things. If there's no water cooler talk, how do you do that? I would hate to start a new job and work from home. I'm pleased to hear, and I was talking to somebody this morning before breakfast, that more and more people are coming back to work. It's not very popular because you've then got the transport costs, the transport time. But I was chairman of Sasfin Bank, as Brian indicated. Sasfin Bank, once a week, has a short session with all staff on ethics. This is how this bank does business. This is our ethical tone. This is what we stand for. Now, the vision is very important. But it's not only creating, setting, and communicating. It's sweating that vision. You've got to continuously come back to it. Because the vision gives the grounding to your team. Come back to it. The leader drives the big issues. Now, we've all worked for micromanagers. You know how painful that is. And I might be slightly guilty of that. But drive the big issues. Walking the talk is very important. The leader is always prepared. You're the first to arrive, you're the last to leave, and you've read the board pack more than anybody else. That's what leadership is. But you've always got to be there and you've got to be visible. Now, we had a silly rule at Liberty when I was the CEO. Members of the executive management were not allowed to use the lifts. We had to use the escalators. So people could see us, they could stop us, and they could talk to us. We were visible, we were alive. I'll share with you another interesting example. I was chairman of Virgin Active, as you can see. Interesting story how I became chairman, and Jeff, I think maybe you were even there. At President Mandela's first inauguration, I'm sitting there, sitting next to Coleman Andrews of SAA fame. We actually did good work for SAA, by the way. And this guy came up to me and said, Mr. Branson wants to meet you. I go up, he says, we have a drink before lunch. And Richard said, after we'd done the niceties, he said, I need help. I believe you got government contacts. I said, no, that's not true, but how can I help you? He said, I need more landing rights in Cape Town. Familiar ringing over the last week. I looked at him and I said, you know, Mr. Branson, that's a bit awkward. He said, why? I said, because I'm a director of South African Airways. And with that, he jumped all over his staff and he said, better we have another gin. Fast forward X years, I was the chairman of Virgin Active South Africa. Coming back to the topic of leadership, however, I flew down to Cape Town to have a meeting with Richard. And the meeting was around the pool at the Cullinan Hotel. He was in his swimming costume. We had our meeting and I said to him, you know, Richard, why do you stay at the Cullinan? And he looked at me as if I was dim-witted. He said, where does the air crew stay? I said, I presume the Cullinan. He says, that's why I stay at the Cullinan. Then he said to me, what are you doing this afternoon? I said, no, I'm flying back to Johannesburg. He says, no, I've chartered a yacht and I'm taking last night's air crew, cabin crew and pilots, sailing in Table Bay. Join us. Now, can you imagine when that air crew got back, it's probably one of 100 air crews, back to London, and they say, we went sailing with Richard in Table Bay. I mean, there are a lot of lessons to be learned from his touch. By the way, he's not in private, he's not this outgoing guy. He's he's almost shy. All right. Whoops, what happened there? Moving on. Leaders communicate. We're looking at two very interesting examples at the moment. I think our president, for example, did well during COVID. Those Sunday night family chats, we didn't like the news he was giving us, but it showed us the person. And I thought he was very convincing. But we've got the classic example at the moment, where we've got a comedian leading a country at war, and boy, does he know how to communicate. And does he know how to use his cell phone and his Twitter account. But you think about it, he's spoken to the United Nations, he's spoken to the Congress, He's spoken to the British Parliament. That's communication. So it shows you leaders are not only doers, they're also communicators. The first example of communication that comes to mind was General Montgomery in the Second World War. Remember, the British in Egypt were being hammered by Rommel. Montgomery came as the new general of the 8th Army. He wasn't the first choice. The first choice was killed in an air smash. So he came in as the second choice. And he realized he had two challenges. First of all, he needed better armor. He needed Sherman tanks from the Americans. But he needed to lift the morale. The morale of the 8th Army was bad because they'd been retreating for months. So what he did is he went to all the units and he'd stand on top of his jeep wearing his black beret with two badges on it, totally illegal, one the armor badge, one the staff badge, and he would just talk to the troops. Just talk to the troops. And suddenly they had something tangible that they could hang on to. So that communication, visibility, people being able to approach you is very important. At Liberty, I had a thing called Have Lunch with Roy. Any staff member, once a month, could book to come to the dining room and have lunch with Roy. Some of them were great, some of them were painful, but everybody had an opportunity to come and have lunch with Roy. Talking about Montgomery, I love the apocryphal story. At his daughter's wedding, he went up to his new son-in-law and said, "Son, now that you're my son-in-law, you don't have to call me sir anymore. Field marshal will do." Right? It's apocryphal because he didn't have a daughter, he had a son. Leaders enthuse and they excite people. You've got to make it exciting to work in this company. And some companies do it better than others. Leaders exhibit the values. They're honest. They do what is right. They're fair and consistent. Promotions are seen to be consistent. Awards and bonuses are seen to be fair and consistent. They require discipline. And they require professionalism. Sorry, I know this is a shopping list. You know all. I'm not telling you anything new. But I'm just saying to you, think about these things. This is one that we all say we do, but we don't. Promote an open, challenging culture. The truth must be heard in the organization. Just because you're the CEO doesn't mean to say you're the fountain of truth. As Leila said earlier on, you weren't necessarily the smartest person in the room, but you knew that you needed inputs. Listen objectively. Set the expectations, especially when you take over, when you become the CEO. Make it clear what your expectations are, and that only the best is good enough. I left one off the slide, and I noticed last night. I wanted to say, ensure that all your decisions result in sustainable value for the company. Measure them against that. You handle the media. Bring you back to, what's his name, Zelensky. Does he know how to handle the media? And the Russians are losing the media war. I'm not sure they're going to lose the overall war. But as an aside, if we had time, I'd like to tell you why I think the Russians did so poorly at the beginning. It boils down to leadership, logistics, planning. And Zelensky getting good intelligence from the British and the Americans, and weapons. But that's a different subject, different speech. Also respect your subordinates. Don't steal their time. The fact that you come late for meetings, that you waffle, and you hold your staff there, shows total disrespect for your staff. Their time is as important as yours. Leaders surround themselves with smart people. And perhaps I should have said ethical people. Delegate and empower. People often get delegation wrong. There's no sense in promoting somebody, put them in the corner office, give them a bigger carpet, if they don't have the knowledge and access to information they need to succeed. That's sometimes, with respect, and I'm going into a sensitive area, why some BE candidates are seen not to succeed. They've got the office, they've got the desk, they've got the carpet, so what's the problem? The problem is they haven't been given access to the information to succeed. Their colleagues are not necessarily supporting them and feeding them with information. Educates and develops. Leaders take charge. I've never had that problem. And Leila, I can see you've never had that problem. Accept responsibility. Jeff will remember one of the worst days of my life. When we went from the floor training to the screen training, we started off by putting one share on. Worked well. I think it was Anglo. Then we put on the sector. I think it was the mining sector. It worked. Then the brokers came to me and said, listen, we can't split ourselves between the floor and the screen. You've got to choose. So we went for a big bang. We put everything on the screen. And of course, the inevitable happened. The whole system crashed. Boom. We had consultants from the Chicago Stock Exchange who supplied the system. And I said to them, well, what now? At 2 o'clock in the morning, when the market was going to open the next morning, we still had no idea why it crashed. No idea at all. As an aside, we did solve the problem at about 8 o'clock in the morning. We went to 2 generations of software earlier, and thank goodness it worked. But it was one of my worst moments because eventually, at 2 in the morning, the team from the Chicago Stock Exchange came to me and said, sorry, we're going to bed. We're going to the Carlton Hotel. We don't know what to say. And I said one of the worst things I've ever said in my life. I said to the CEO, congratulations. He said, what do you mean congratulations? I've said, I've waited 20 years to find out why you lost the Vietnam War. Now I know why. Isn't that a terrible thing to say? Anyway, it worked. And the reason, by the way, is the latest software was sending too many messages backwards and forwards. But, you know, and it couldn't handle the capacity. Leaders make the tough decisions. Leaders show confidence. Now, how do you do that? I've had 2 bad days in my life. One was when the system went down. And that was not easy. But I had to show confidence. As an aside, on the day it went down, I called a press conference. And I said, the systems are crashed. I didn't have to, in fact, I had to phone the minister. I had to phone the governor of the Reserve Bank. I didn't have to phone the press other than to tell them to come to the conference because the brokers, of course, had all phoned the press to say the system was down. But I stood before the group and said, the system is down. Only one person is responsible. That's me. And interestingly enough, I didn't get chewed up in the paper the next day. Had I not said, it's me, I would have got chewed up. Anyway, there you go. But we also had, I'll come back to my second experience, but we also had tough days at the JSE. Marches, don't forget it was the time of the transition. Big marches outside the JSE. I remember walking through this big crowd of chanting people, and the person who handed me the petition was Jairendra Naidu, and he and I became friends afterwards. It's a strange world, he's a good guy. But you had to walk through that. And then also bombs, what was not known. The idea that there was a plan to blow the JSE up. And our security was so good, and we inspected underneath of cars, etc., so well that they couldn't get the bomb in. And that's the bomb that went off at OR Tambo, remember? That bomb was originally meant, I've since, through my army connections, met the people who planted the bombs. But I've had my second bad day, where I had to show leadership, was I was taking casualties, and I couldn't get helicopters in to evacuate them because the communications collapsed. And these guys were dying around me. That's not a nice day. But you can't show your troops. You might feel it in here, but you can't show it. And the other important thing to know, of course, is, as a leader, know when to leave. Look at Mandela. Mandela knew when to leave. He could have stayed on, but he left just at the right time. I wish I had time to tell you about the privileges that I had of meeting and working with Mr. Mandela. But he knows when to leave. Compare that with Margaret Thatcher. She didn't know when to leave. So, you'll be pleased to hear that's my checklist. So, how did you do? How does your boss do? How does your politician do? I must say, I'm full of admiration for the current generation of leaders, although they haven't been through quite the same trauma. I don't think I would like to have led during this COVID. I don't think I have enough technical nous to understand how people can work from home and how to manage that process, not only technologically, but how to manage the motivation, the coordination. So I admire the current leaders. How do leaders deal with adversity? Well, first of all, in times of adversity, you must be professional and you must be dignified. Now, we're going through adversity at the moment. Think of the companies that can't get their export products out of Durban or Cape Town. People who can't import products at the moment because there's a worldwide shortage of chips. People who aren't sure where they're going to get their grain from. We're going through really tough times. Be professional, be dignified, and most important, don't blame your predecessor. When you blame your predecessor, it says more about you than your predecessor. You don't know what your predecessor went through. Show strength, be visible all the time. Leaders must be visible. Once again, going back to Zelensky, it's not only what he's saying, he is visible, he exists. You see him all the time, and hopefully the population do. And then there's a thing called loneliness of command. When we were young lieutenants, or we were on our lieutenant's course, they had a whole day on how to handle loneliness of command. There are situations in life where there's nobody you can talk to. You're the boss. You can't share everything with your 2IC. You can't share everything with your wife or your husband because it might not be relevant. You've got to decide how you're going to handle this loneliness of command. And the Defence Force taught us how to do that. And of course, you must make the tough decisions. But what have we got there? Thanks, Brian. Now, leaders are often made in times of adversity. Look at President Mandela. Adversity actually made him. Now, I see President Mandela through rose-tinted glasses because I saw a bit of him, and I worked with him a bit. I'll tell you a quick war story about him just now. But he used the adversity, probably not consciously, but he grew into this amazing person who influenced the world. And to show you how powerful he was, I was once speaking at a conference in London. It was an Investec conference. I was talking, and I thought I had the audience under control. And he walked in through the back door, and without anybody saying anything, the whole audience turned around. Now, nobody said Mr. Mandela's just arrived. That's the magnetism that he had. Let me finish the two others, and then I'll come back to one war story about President Mandela. Look at Churchill in the Second World War. Now, Churchill in the First World War was a disaster. He was responsible for the Dardanelles debacle, which wiped out a lot of the youth of New Zealand and Australia. But in the Second World War, cometh the hour, cometh the man. In peacetime, he was soon voted out. And then look at Rudy Giuliani. During 9/11, Bush was a non-entity. The person who came out of 9/11 best was in fact Rudy Giuliani. Now at that stage, he was going through a rough patch. He was known as the mayor with a libido problem. And of course, subsequently, he's proved to have other problems in his choice of leaders. But he came out a better. Let me tell you a quick story about President Mandela. Let's see, which one shall I choose? President Mandela, I was driving to the airport one day. My wife and I were going overseas in the car. The phone rang in the car. And this voice said, "Is that Roy Andersen?" I said, "Yes." He said, "It's President Mandela here." Now you get a phone call from at 5 o'clock on a Friday evening, 5:30, and the person says it's Mandela. Yeah, you're a little bit dubious. You wonder which DJ from which radio station. So anyway, he said to me, "What are you doing on Friday, such and such dates?" I said, "No, nothing." He said, "I want you to come and have breakfast with me." So of course, I arrived at his official residence in Pretoria 5 minutes early. There was the old man, beautifully turned out in the suit. He really cut a good figure in the suit, didn't he? A good figure. And he said, "Sit down." He said, "Tell me what it's like to be a young white South African." I said, well, I'm not so young anymore, but I'm obviously white. And we had this most amazing conversation over breakfast. But I loved the way he got rid of me. He then looked at his watch. He told me early on that he had a meeting with President Mugabe that day. And he looked at his watch. He said, you know, Roy, it's 8 o'clock. You're a very busy man. I mustn't keep you. Right? Of course, a couple of months later, the phone rang again. What are you doing on Friday? I said, no, you tell me. He said, come to my house in Houghton. I'm now retired. And he said, let's have another chat. So I said, sure. And of course, he came straight to the point. He was wearing a tracksuit this time, chasing the grandkids off to school. And the naughtiest one, I believe his name was Gaddafi, because he was late for school, so he got into trouble. And then the old man said, I need help. I said, what's the help? He said, and this is an old story, we need a new school in Petersburg, and I want Liberty to build it. I said, whoa, 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 you're talking to the wrong person. We have a foundation. Talk to Hilton. No, I'm talking to you. So I said, let me think about it. But I took with me a picture that was taken on the floor of the JSE. Jeff, remember the day he came and addressed all the brokers and the world? Every TV camera was there that day, just before the elections. And I said, would you mind autographing the picture? Oh, he said, sure, very good. I got home that night and I said to Wendy, hey, I got Madiba's autograph. She says, that's great, let me have a look. And he's written on the picture, to my good friend Roy, who never turns down a good cause. Of course, the phone rang a couple of weeks later. He says, Roy, you're a general in the army. I said, yes. He said, do you know how to get to Swartkops Air Force Base? I said, yes. He said, we're taking off next Friday at 6:30. Be there. So we get on the plane, and I said, can I bring Hilton? Sure. We get on the plane, we fly to Petersburg. We land, he gets met by a stretch limo. Hilton and I get met by the second best car, which happened to be a hearse, right, with a flag in the front. And we go to the school, a primary school, and he wanted a high school built. And we walk through, now I'm waiting to go into the principal's office or the meeting room. No, we keep walking. And when we get to the quadrangle, it is full. Every school kid, every MEC, every tribal chief, and national television. The former president stands up and he says, you see those two gentlemen there from Liberty? Oh, they're very rich, very rich. Now Mr. Andersen is going to tell you what he's going to do for you. 7 million rands of school, worth of school. But I must say to his credit, when the school was built, we were invited back. And he made sure we got our money's worth. But the story had a tail. When we got back to the aircraft, the pilot I knew, we'd flown together in Angola. And the pilot stands there. He looks at me and he says, he was a colonel. I was a general. Ja, generaal. Ek kan sien jy was ook gevang, né? I said, ja, maar hy sê, moenie bekommerd wees nie. Môre is dit meneer Brian Joffie van Bidwest. Hy gaan 2 skole koop. But the day I retired, the first phone call I got genuinely was from President Mandela. Welcome to the world of pensioners. So he was a true leader. Anyway, enough of the stories. I'm going to start putting it together because you've got work to do. As a leader, do you have to be the best technician? I don't think you have to be the best technician. Let me give an example that some of the men here are old enough to relate to. When we won the World Cup, was it 95? 96, 95? I'm not sure that Francois Pinault was the best flank in the country, but he was the best captain for the Springbok. So you don't have to be the best technician, but you must understand the business, and you must take time to understand the business. And that's been one of my challenges, moving from auditing to stockbroking to life insurance, then construction. You're always slightly at a disadvantage. In auditing, I wasn't, because I grew up as an auditor. So it's not so easy in that environment. Is there more than one leadership style? The answer is yes. But you know what the answer is? Be yourself. You can't act a leadership style. Be yourself. I guess I had a privilege, but a sobering experience, of twice having to stand in front of my regiment in Angola the night before a battle, or the afternoon before a battle. There's no room there for pose. Because those troops, 700 eyes, look at you. And you could hear a pin drop. It wasn't necessarily because they thought I was going to impart pearls of wisdom. They were assessing, is this turkey going to get us killed tomorrow? But you have to be there, and you can't fake a leadership style. And now I'm getting near the end. So yes, be yourself. There's a shift. There used to be celebrity leaders. Remember when Jack Welch was at the height of his power? To be a leader, you had to be on television every night. That was the leader. It's shifted. The leader is often now the quietly determined. And there are lots of former CFOs in leadership positions. And I'm not doing a punt for my profession. Some accountants are bad leaders. But you can go from CFO, a corporate lawyer, or one of the engineers to being the leader. If you're quietly determined and focused, you don't have to be a celebrity. How do you ensure that your strategies get implemented? Because we've all got beautiful strategic plans. How do you get them implemented? The answer is be purposeful. That's how the Financial Mail described me in my retirement notice. They described me as purposeful. That means that at times I was maybe a bit of a pain because I was driving issues, pushing issues. But be purposeful. Sweat the plan. Use every opportunity to remind the team, this is the plan, this is the vision, this is where we're going. Don't let it just sort of amble along in the company. Drive it. Talking about sweating the plan, I was privileged to work with some great leaders. Donald Gordon, Richard Branson, General Shockey. I worked with Johan van Zyl at Sanlam. Great leaders. But one story I like very much is about Donald Gordon. And say what you like about Gordon. He didn't build one fortune, he built two. He built one in South Africa at Liberty, and he replicated that in London when you couldn't take capital out of the country. So it was no accident. It was him. He was an annoying guy to work with at times because we'd give a presentation to him with all the facts and the figures. And he'd look at you and say, no, you're wrong. So we'd say, okay, Donald, what's wrong? My stomach tells me. And I'm telling you, he was never wrong. Infuriating. He would make decisions that weren't necessarily based on accounting logic. They were based on his own instinct. And I never saw him get it wrong. And there was a lovely story told about him, and I think it might be apocryphal. But at a board meeting, right near the end before they went off, remember we used to have board lunches in those days, the guests had already arrived. He put a proposal to the board, and he spoke eloquently about it. And he put it to the vote. And he was outvoted 14-1. And as chairman, he summarized as follows. He said, in view of the fact that this board is so deeply divided on this matter, we'll vote again next month. And the story goes that it went through next month. I can remember that's my last war story. The decision to build the Sandton Convention Centre, which was in Liberty property, as you know, Sandton Centre. On paper, it made no sense. The numbers did not stack up. And Donald Gordon just looked at us and said, trust me. And it's been a great success. So there's no substitute for instinct. And let me also say, people don't know, but I've never seen such a generous man. What Donald Gordon did, we see the visit, we see the Gibbs, we see the hospital, we see the house at the Tess. The things that he did on a Friday night behind the scenes were incredible. He hasn't got enough credit for that. Errol, I see you sitting there. I think you saw some of it when you were at Liberty. Okay, let me close. Let's come back to my inappropriate story about the hobo. We have a problem. If we think that we can sit in this country with a gap between the haves and have-nots growing, where on paper, and please, I'm not pointing fingers at an individual, the CEO can get 200 million and the staff can get very little increases. And I know there's circumstances behind the 200 million. it's not a sustainable situation. We saw it last June in KZN, and I went and visited the soldiers down there last June. It was tough. It was places like Belito. It was rugged to be there. So what are we going to do about it? We can all just sit here and say, yeah, it's tough. The president must be more forceful. He must do more things. Probably true. But we have to do things. So let me close by saying the following. Go back to conclusion. South Africa needs to convert the political miracle into an economic and societal miracle. Each of us has a role to play in providing the correct leadership to ensure success. If we don't have strong, ethical leaders in this country, we're in trouble. Thank you.
It's difficult to follow Dr. Leila Fourie and Roy Andersen, but I will try in a very quick second because I'm sure everybody needs to leave. Thank you very much for coming out this morning. It's the second breakfast in our series, and we hope to continue to roll these out. I think some of the things that I took away from it is that as leaders, despite the fact that it might be a lonely place, we have to reach out for help, that there are voices and minds and thoughts out there that we need to grapple on, to challenge our perspectives, to find a new path forward. Because whilst we can learn from history, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to repeat it. I think that as leaders, we have to ensure that we aren't always the smartest people in the room, that there are smarter people than us, providing us with different thoughts and perspectives. I recently read a book by Matthew Syed called Rebel Ideas, and he talks about cognitive diversity, that we actually as leaders have to seek it out. We are conditioned to read the same things, to find the same perspectives, to be surrounded by people that are supporting our points of view. That in South Africa, it is so challenging and so different, and we have to be able to see what those solutions are, and they may not be coming from our natural network and our natural circles. We have to be comfortable with some of that challenge and some of the uncomfortable ideas that may be changing our perspectives. Some of the thoughts I took from Roy Andersen is that vision is by far the most important thing we as leaders need to be setting. People need something to strive for. They need a direction to move in, and they need something that they can hold on to and that they believe in. But the second most important thing is that we need to be able to implement the practical steps to achieve that vision. And we are great at talking and thinking, but the implementation becomes the thing that we can hold on to, that we set a legacy for our businesses and create a sustainable future, that we are only custodians of our businesses. We aren't there to hold on to them. We are there to set them forward into the future and develop leaders. So I want to thank Roy Andersen and Dr. Leila Fourie. It's been a really insightful morning. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And if you aren't rushing off, please join us for some tea and coffee afterwards. Thank you.